Hello and welcome. In this video, we shall delve into the similarities and differences between Donna Tartt's The Secret History and M.L. Rio's If We Were Villains. The reason I decided to come up with this video is because searches on If We Were Villains has often associated it and linked it with Donna Tartt's The Secret History. On the other hand, recommendations for more books like Donna Tartt's The Secret History suggests If We Were Villains. In fact, one of the praises for If We Were Villains compares it and likens it to Donna Tartt's The Secret History. Much like Donna Tartt's The Secret History, M.L. Rio's sparkling debut is a richly layered story of love, friendship, and obsession. And that is the very first similarity between these books. The Secret History was Donna Tartt's debut novel, and If We Were Villains is M.L. Rio's debut novel. Not only are both these books their respective authors or writers' debut novel, but both these writers have had a history with and an educational background in the subjects that they are dealing with. For instance, Tartt actually studied classics, which is the subject that her characters in The Secret History are also studying. And in M.L. Rio's case as well, she herself has been a thespian, like her characters. So she's not talking about something that she doesn't know. She didn't pick up the subject just while researching for the book. It was something that has been a part of her life for a very long time. And the second similarity is that both these books deal with murders. So both these books deal with an exclusive group of students, and one of them is murdered. But the difference lies in the consequences of the murder. In The Secret History, there are no legal consequences. The repercussions are more personal, more psychological, in the form of guilt. However, in Villains, there are legal repercussions. In fact, when the story opens, one of the students, the student who was accused of having murdered his classmate, is let out of prison, and it is when he comes out of prison that he decides to tell the whole story. And while the backdrop of both these books is quite similar in terms of the fact that they are a very close-knit group of students, there are very few students who are studying the subject, that the population of the class, so to speak, is less. The students are very well acquainted with each other. They've spent a significant duration of time with each other. They know each other quite well, and there is a marked intimacy between them, which plays a significant role in the plot of the story. Now, while again that is a similarity, the difference lies in the victims in both these books. The student who is murdered. The student who is murdered in Donna Tartt's The Secret History is very different in character from the student who is murdered in Villains. And I also point this out because the protagonist of the story, the character that is narrating the story, is quite similar in both these books. And before I forget, I should point out that there is one name which is the character's name in both these books, which is Richard. In Secret History, the protagonist is Richard Papin, and in If We Were Villains, one of the characters is Richard Sterling. Now, when the Secret History starts off, we know right off the bat which student is murdered. But in If We Were Villains, that is implicit. It's not explicitly said, but we can get a very good idea of who it is. But anyway, never mind. I'm going to try to keep that to myself and not slip that out in the course of this conversation or video. And from this we move on to the next point, which is academic obsession. In both these books, we see the students, the characters, the central players being obsessed with the subject that they are studying, which again has a significant role to play in the movement, in the progression of the plot. In classics, in Donna Tartt's Secret History, we see that the characters are very deeply influenced by the Greeks and the Romans, the classics that they are studying, especially the languages that they are studying. In Villains, we see the students being deeply influenced by Shakespeare. Here we see them talking in Greek and Latin sometimes, and here we see, in fact, there's more Shakespearean language here than there's Greek and Latin here in The Secret History. And I suppose that is why, that's probably because Rio wanted to really impose on us the degree of influence that the subject that the students have been studying, the classes that they've been taking, how deeply that's influenced them. Because it also deals with the fact that it also brings forth the fact that this is not something that they are studying only for the past 3 years or 4 years. Again, this is something that both these books talk about. It's something that they have been acquainted with for a major part of their lives. In fact, while this may not have been explicitly dealt with in The Secret History, the protagonist or the narrator in Villains has talked about it, has talked about how Shakespeare's plays and poetry has been a part of his life even before he started studying at the conservatory. The characters or the protagonist's obsession with the subject that they are studying links to another difference between these two books, and that is in terms of the reference that is made. The reference to classics in Donna Tartt's The Secret History is, in my opinion, a lot more subtle and a lot more implicit than the reference to Shakespeare in Rio's Villains. In Rio's Villains, the Shakespearean language is very in our face. The characters use it in conversations with each other almost every single day. I don't think there's a single conversation in the book which does not have at least one Shakespearean quote in it. Even when we are interacting with the protagonist's thoughts, when there is no dialogue, Shakespeare's quotes seep in there as well. And I think that's quite understood because the protagonist here, the narrator, Oliver, has spent so much time with Shakespeare, studying, reading, learning, that it does slip out in language. There are entire conversations that the characters have, or at least half of conversations that characters have, which are exchanged using Shakespeare's quotes or language or scenes, dialogues from Shakespeare's plays. And it is very beautiful to watch for anybody who, beautiful to read for anybody who is interested in Shakespeare. For anybody who does not like Shakespeare, who's not fond of Shakespeare at all, that's going to be a huge task to get through those paragraphs. But you can skip them and still understand the story. They have been italicized, so it's very easy to spot them from a mile away. Now, in contrast to that, we have Donna Tartt's The Secret History, where the entire feel of the Greeks and the Romans and Greek and Latin as languages itself is very subtle. It seeps through, it permeates through the entire book as an undercurrent, as an atmosphere, as a vibe, in the personality of the characters themselves, in a very implicit way. Another example would be at the very start of this book itself, Oliver assigns each role to each character. Now, this has a very strong role to play in the development of the plot. But here, in The Secret History, there was no such limitation on Donna Tartt to do that. She did not categorize any of her characters as being pure and evil, good and bad. Because the fact that this is a grey book has been implied right off the bat itself. But here, the fact that it's a grey book comes slowly, comes across comes through the book very slowly. Here, the entire book exudes a sense of the unfamiliar, of something that is very strange and foreign to us, including the characters themselves. In my opinion, if any of these characters from The Secret History were to inhabit the 21st century, I think they would stand out very starkly in a crowd. For instance, Henry or Camilla. And again, I need to take into account the fact that it's only one person's perspective that we get to see in both these books. But in that sense, I think Villains has been a little more fairer and a little more closer to the reality that we are living in than Donna Tartt. But then again, considering that this book deals with classics, which is completely foreign territory, in fact, one of the most beautiful and significant things about the book is the disclaimer that we see in The Secret History in the very beginning itself, where she uses a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is what it says: I inquire now as to the genesis of a philologist and assert the following. First, a young man cannot possibly know what Greeks and Romans are. Secondly, he does not know whether he is suited for finding out about them. And this so aptly captures the nature of this book, the texture of this book, that there is something that is constantly slipping through our fingers. We think that we understand it, but we really don't. But before I get into a full-fledged analysis of The Secret History itself, reverting back to If We Were Villains, the fact that it is rooted in Shakespearean language, in Shakespeare on stage, is very explicit. It's put in our face, and there's no way that we can't see it. Emil Rio wanted us to, and again, that's true to Shakespeare's texture of writing, because we do associate Shakespeare himself with exaggeration. Now, while that may be debated whether he actually did exaggerate or not is up for debate, but we do see a reflection of that in Rio's writing, because her reflection of Shakespeare itself is very in our face. But if we look solely at the characters in Villains, then in comparison to The Secret History, they are more relatable. We can see them in the 21st century. And actually, we do see them on the streets of New York. Which brings me to the next similarity in their protagonists. Now, in The Secret History, there are only 5 characters, while in Villains, there are 7. And like I said before, the characters of the victims, the students who die, is very different. But the character of the protagonists or the narrators in both these stories, in each of these stories, is quite similar. Both are presented, so Richard Papin in The Secret History and Oliver Marks in If We Were Villains. Both of them are presented as harmless, very unextraordinary. In terms of their personality, they don't come off as being dark or twisted or threatening in any way, which is of course crucial to gain the trust of the reader. But a marked difference between both these books would be the writing style. This has a lot more dialogues in it, of course, because it's an ode to Shakespeare. So the format of the book is like watching a play. We are invited to witness the thoughts of the protagonist, of the narrator, every now and then, but for the most part, it deals with a lot of dialogues. In The Secret History, on the other hand, there are more descriptions than there are dialogues. There are more recollections of conversations and distilled recollections of conversations rather than conversations being presented to us verbatim. And Donna Tartt's writing is very subtle, very luxurious, very extravagant and expansive. Not extravagant, but expansive. I would not say that it's very wordy, it's very appropriate, but it's very beautiful. It has a lot of shades to it. With very few words, she can express very deep ideas. She can convey multiple meanings. The way she describes Francis's house, or the night when Richard walked into the room when Charles was playing on the piano and he was reminded of the sinking Titanic, or he imagined what the sinking Titanic must have been like. All of those are so rich, so layered. And while Villains is not shallow, it's not narrow, it's very deep, but there is a difference in the writing style, and the layering, I would say, is less here than in The Secret History. Tartt's descriptions are like a whirlpool that we don't realize we're getting sucked into, and we have a really hard time forgetting it, even after we've finished reading the book. While in Villains, the narration is very straightforward, there are more dialogues, and the descriptions, even though they are less, they are very witty, they're very appropriate, they're very concrete. But they are not, I would say, as textured or as layered as The Secret History. Now, in both these books, we know that a murder is going to take place. So it's not the murder itself which shocks and surprises us, but rather the series of events which unfolds after the murder. The final act or the big climax of the book, of the story, is after the murder. There's something else that happens after the murder which is imperative for us to know, which changes the entire story, which is probably what the story is also all about. Not so much about the murder, which we are told about in the very beginning itself, but something else, which was a repercussion or a consequence of the murder. And we are told of the murder to understand that, which is hidden from us when the story begins. And while this is another aspect which both these books share, the difference lies in unraveling of the characters in the aftermath of the murder. Because in the series of events which unfolds after the murder, it is this, the unraveling of the characters. What happens in the psychology of a person, of a group of people, when they know of a murder, when they are responsible for a murder? And this is where these two books differ. In The Secret History, the post-murder unraveling of the characters is much better expressed, much better conveyed than in If We Were Villains. And what I mean by that is simply that the sense of urgency and panic that Richard Papin was going through, was feeling, in fact, the sense of urgency and panic that everybody in The Secret History was experiencing could be felt. And it left the pages, and I could empathize with that. But in If We Were Villains, it was a little abrupt, it was a little too stark. Suddenly there was a murder, and it seemed to me as though Oliver Marks here was the only one who was losing his mind. And again, I think it is because the focus in If We Were Villains was more on dialogue and descriptions were less, that I felt that disconnect. Because I could see the panic in him, but I couldn't really connect to that sentiment. It did not leap out of the page like it did in The Secret History. And I think it is precisely to give us that sense of panic and agitation, to share that with us, to pull us into that, that Donna Tartt wrote the entire book the way she did, that her writing style is the way it is. She laid the foundation for that entire chapter, for that entire section of the book from the very beginning itself. It's a very, easy atmosphere so that we are lulled into a sense of calm and composure and bucolic life, and nothing's really happening, just a group of kids who are studying, and there's going to be a murder, yeah, sure, but at the end of the day they're all children who are studying, so how bad can it be? And then you see that, oh well, something has gone terribly horribly wrong, and then you see, oh well, something has gone a little more horribly wrong, and then finally you realize what they have done. And because you have been a part of that journey from the very beginning itself, you can feel the agitation, the panic, the fear. Here, I think that sense of lulling the readers into believing that everything is okay in the beginning faltered a little, I suppose. Or perhaps that was intentionally done because the focus here was something else. The focus here was different. It's a lot, it's a lot more Shakespearean. It's not very subtle. And I think that's the fundamental difference between both these books. Rio has focused a lot on imposing things on the readers, imposing an image, imposing an idea. It's very verbose. There's a lot of dialogues, a lot of conversations and talking. And even though these conversations are, refer to a lot of Shakespeare's language and his plays, and it's deeply rooted in Shakespeare's plays. So anybody who's familiar with Shakespeare's plays, or who has performed Shakespeare, who enjoys reading Shakespeare, is going to have a really good time with this book. Even if you don't like the plot, I think the sense of respect that Rio has for Shakespeare is very well reflected here. And the same goes for Donna Tartt in her love for classics as well. But I think it's because she focused so much on subtlety that the shock was expressed very well. The shock was shared by the reader just as much as it was experienced by the characters. The shock of what they had done and the consequences that were coming to them in the form of their own guilt. And that, I believe, is the difference between the post-murder unraveling of the characters in both these books. Well, with that, we bring this brief encounter to a close. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, if you found it helpful or entertaining in any way, do subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.